Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Hordes Dairyman monthly webinar series. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hordes Dairyman magazine. The title of today's presentation is Raising Calves on Autofeeders. Will it work for you? Our presenter is Dr. Robert James, a professor emeritus from the Department of Dairy Science at Virginia Tech. Today, he works as a consultant for Down Home Heifer Solutions and has a tremendous amount of knowledge in the areas of group raising calves and feeding calves with auto feeders. We look forward to learning more from him about the best management practices for raising calves in this kind of situation and determining if it might be a good fit for you or the clients that you work with. Our webinar is sponsored by TechMix, and we are very grateful for their support of this program. My co-host for today is Mike Hutchins, a professor emeritus from the University of Illinois. Other team members include our webinar producer, Jim Baltz, who's also at the University of Illinois, and our Hordes Dairyman online media manager, Patty Hurchin. If you're listening to the presentation live, you have access to PDF handouts of the slides. You can find those in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. Print that out and feel free to keep those for future reference or to take notes on. Also, if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, please type those into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. And once Dr. James is done with his presentation, we'll go through those questions towards the end of the webinar. So please let us know if you have any thoughts or questions that come up on this topic. At this time, Mike, if you would, please take a few moments and further introduce Dr. James, and then we will get started with this month's presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Abby, and it is my professional and personal honor to introduce Dr. Robert or Bob James. I call him Bob. Bob grew up in Pennsylvania, received his bachelor's degree at the University of Delaware, master's and PhD at Virginia Tech, and then joined that staff in 1974. Dr. James has had a very productive career at Virginia Tech in the Dairy Science Department with areas of responsibility in extension, research, and teaching. His research focus was on dairy calves and heifers, management of farm pasteurizing systems, and today's topic, automatic calf feeding. He was a founding member of the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association, a very active organization here in the U.S., and was a board member for over 10 years. And as Abby already has indicated, he has established a consulting business service there over the last 5 years. So, Dr. James, it is our honor to turn the microphone over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank TechMix and thank Dr. Hutchins for the introduction, and also for Hordes, just doing a great job with these webinars. Really very, very professional, and appreciate the help of Jim. So today's topic is managing calves on auto feeders. Will it work for you? And I think before we get started, let's think about what's next for dairy calf management. I'm just going to run through these topics because I think they have a bearing on how we need to raise calves or think about raising calves in the future. With labor, the availability, the cost, I'd like to say the effectiveness of labor, achieving growth potential on pre-wean calf nutrition. I think in the past our goal's been to how quick can we wean them and lower our cost per day, and is that really the right thing? Having data for proactive calf management. If we look at most of our systems today, conventionally, we really don't have a lot of good data to manage calves accurately. The other one is social development, and this I think is a real exciting area. There's been some great work done at it. University of British Columbia, we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, consumer impressions of dairy calf management. And this is something that I think we need to be very cognizant of. Now, there are some benefits of group management of calves. And by group, I mean either paired or group housed calves. These calves learn from each other. You'll see them have earlier starter intake because they see their buddy eating starter. They adapt better to novel situations. And I think that's really important as we look at cows adapting to change. Less stressful weaning. You know, we've talked about how calves hit the wall when they're weaned. Well, these guys have already been in a group together, so we've eliminated that one. And there's some real great research and experience of producers that show that that's really not a big issue. And my question is, does this have an impact on their behavior as cows? And I think the practical experience of quite a few producers says that, yeah, that might happen. But there are risks. And I think historically, we've really shied away from calf-to-calf contact. And so I think there needs to be a very much of a focus on disease prevention. It's a different way of caring for calves, and we generally don't like change, particularly folks that get up to the age of Mike Hutchins and myself. But it's a good way, I think, to consider for a lot of folks. Now, there are options for group housing, and there are mob feeders, and we can see that picture on the right where there are mob feeders, and I think they can be successful under the right management. Acidified Free Choice in our lower left-hand corner is a facility that I've worked with. Very, very successful. They feed an acidified milk replacer. But we're going to emphasize auto feeders today. And I've had the great opportunity to work with some really exceptional users of auto feeders. And so I learned not only the research perspective, but also the experience of producers. So our first poll question, Dr. Hutchins.
Yes, Bob, very good. What a system, get ready to vote here, folks. What system of feeding group housed do you consider most suitable? And you have 5 choices, so let's get ready to vote here. Vote, only get to pick one. Already Bob talked about paired housing in hutches. Second choice, mob feeding, which is the group of calves you saw there. The acidified Free Choice, auto feeders, the 4th choice, or number 5, none. I'm convinced that individual feeding is best. And as always, we ask our resident expert, Abby, to vote who she thinks is going to win. So, Abby, which one are you picking?
Well, I think this question is maybe a little more opinion, so I don't know which one will win necessarily, but I think one of the neat things is that traveling to different farms, getting to see so many different ways that people do successfully raise their calves. At the Hortz farm, we have switched to, we still have some calf hutches, but then we have been raising calves in groups for quite a number of years now. And then more recently, we have added auto feeders. So we have a little bit of a combination of individual feeding and then auto feeders. So I'll be curious to see what our audience and what our audience members consist of.
Yes, Jim, let's go ahead and close the polls. We got almost 75% in. And Bob, what do you think of the survey?
That's about what I expected. It's a little bit of everything. I think acidified's probably been more popular in Canada. The mob feeding can work well. I think you need to have someone who's a little bit of a traffic cop, and it works a little bit better on smaller dairies. But I think that, quite frankly, I think that paired housing under some situations and auto feeders are something that, and it's obvious that there are a lot of people think that that's something that they ought to think about using. So it really helps me to position a little bit of how we're going to talk about things. So let's move on. Let's see. Okay, are auto feeders a viable option for my dairy? And I want to be very clear, I don't think this is something for everybody. I'm going to emphasize, if we're going to do it, let's plan for success. Okay, let's plan for success. The first one is facility design. Get some professional assistance. If you've got a good engineer, but particularly somebody maybe who doesn't have a vested interest in selling you something. Wisconsin has done a phenomenal job, I think, in providing information on ventilation in the positive pressure tubes. There are other ways of ventilating, but we need to provide year-round provision of fresh air. I want good drainage. We've got manure, urine, and water to collect and process, and also equipment cleaning liquids. So this has got to be part of the picture. And I think this is something that we're going to see required for nutrient management plans in the future. We have materials to handle: milk replacer powder, milk, calf starter, bedding. How are we going to do that? There's biosecurity. I like to say that no one goes in the calf barn if they've been in the cow barn. And I think this is something that we do ignore on some farms. And finally, if we're going to do this, let's plan on being able to connect to the internet. We'll see why in just a little bit. The other question we have is, do we retrofit or build new? Boy, I've got this good old facility, and oh my gosh, I really, maybe I can get that to work with calves. Well, again, let's be realistic and let's make some plans with someone who can help us make an intelligent decision on this. People. I want a calf manager. I want someone who has a passion for calves, has some observational skill of calf behavior, is passionate about sanitation, and who likes data. You know, they're going to use data to complement calf observation and make proactive decisions. Is this labor saving? Maybe you're going to have fewer people, but I think hopefully they're going to be more effective, and they're going to be a lot more happy with their job because they're not out there exposed to the elements, whether that's heat or cold or rain or snow. So I think that there's some advantages there. The other one, as a nutritionist, that really makes me excited is the opportunity, I think, to feed this calf better. First thing, we have to have a commitment to feed enough milk or milk replacer, particularly early on for that calf, so that they can achieve their growth potential. We need to have a commitment to high quality liquid diet and water, regardless if we're feeding a milk or milk replacer. I want to focus on achieving the genetic potential for gain and for health. Notice that I think we want to change our emphasis. We used to emphasize, oh, I want to get them weaned soon so that I can really save money on milk and get that rumen developed. Maybe we need to do a little bit of a compromise there. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. I want to focus on quality and cost per pound of gain and not cost per day. Cost per day may not meet the nutrient requirements of that calf, may not optimize that. And if we feed more milk, we have more milk, more energy, and more nutrients left over for growth because we've diluted out some of that maintenance expense. So why autofeeders? Well, I think the ability to feed calves according to nutrient requirements. Let's let them have more milk early in life when they're not eating very much calf starter, regardless of how much milk or milk replacer we might feed. We can now limit their meal size so they're not gorged with a large meal that may only be twice a day. And now we can let them eat multiple smaller meals. They can respond to changes in the environment. If it gets really cold, they can up their intake, and according to appetite. It's a lot more normal feeding behavior. I think if we look at how beef calves nurse the dam, this is trying to replicate a little bit more of that. And again, we've talked about feed costs per pound of gain. If we can provide more nutrients available for growth and less proportionately for maintenance, we can improve that economic economy of gain. So why autofeeders? Well, if I can retain a highly qualified calf manager because they just really love that job. We remove some of the drudgery chores of washing buckets and bottles and some of the manual labor involved. We now have data that's automatically collected to monitor feeding behavior and let us maybe proactively manage calves. So what are some of the wrong reasons for autofeeders? I'm going to save a pile of money on labor. I like to save, well, maybe I'll have fewer people, but more qualified people. So I don't list that as the real top thing there. Excuse me a minute. And lower milk or milk replacer costs. Not necessarily so, because we're probably going to feed more milk or milk replacer. Again, it's for a relatively short period of time. I really want to focus on that first 30 to 45 days. Now, there are multiple manufacturers of automatic calf feeders that are available in the US and also globally. The Forster Technic company manufactures those for DeLaval, Lely, and Gia. Each one of those companies has some unique features, but they're manufactured by Forster Technic in Germany. Holman Lau is another very popular one, and Urban is another popular one. And it's interesting to note that most of these are made in Germany. And then we have the Biotic Feeders, which is a smaller company, and this is more of a basic machine with not a whole lot of automatic capabilities. So which autofeeder? Well, I think some of that depends upon, does this company have development of technology and software? What's their online and phone support? What's the dealer service and support? What I've found with almost all these autofeeders is they're really very well engineered, regardless of the manufacturer. And so I've seen some of these machines. Well, the one that we have at our university is well over 10 years old and still going pretty strong. So they're durable and they're relatively simple to own and to operate. So now, which auto feeder? And some of the desired features that I look for, and I start off with, I want it to deliver milk or milk replacer both accurately and precisely, close, and then to what we want them to feed, and then do it day after day after day. I want to be able to establish feeding plans. We'll show some examples: the amount per day, an amount per meal, an interval between meal, and then to be able to regulate the solids level, particularly if we're mixing milk replacers, so that that's relatively consistent. Remember that those goals of consistency. Can I deliver medications or additives such as electrolytes, probiotics, prebiotics in the liquid or dry form automatically when I enroll that calf? Sanitation. And I'd like it to be automated from the mixer to that calf nipple. And again, these manufacturers, particularly the more automated ones, do a pretty good job. If I'm going to do it, I put this as a high priority, and that can be a challenge on some farms. Ideally, I'd like to be able to access the internet. Many of the more technical machines are cloud-based. In other words, they back up the data, and it can be accessed by the consultant, by the farm manager, the farm owner, the veterinarian. And I find this really useful. I monitor the performance of calves on several dairies that I work with. And there also can be automated messages that come to the calf manager if we have an issue with equipment function. Now, that's not mandatory, but it sure is desirable, I think, to access the internet. And finally, data. And I think the typical data that we see is daily consumption, drinking speed on a particular calf, breaks, which means the calf walks into the stall but then backs out before it's consumed its meal, to look at trends in data. Some of them enable us to enter health records, and some will interface with DairyComp or PC Dart or other dairy records platforms. And I think those are real desirable features. So we've made the decision, and let's plan for success. And I think this is really key to successful implementation. And I'm going to start off with a positive dairy management mindset. You know, this is an investment in calf management. And I think some of the problems that I see is people cut some corners early on to try and save some money, and they seriously compromise the function of that piece of equipment long term. And to me, that's a really big concern. The other one's herd health, and I start with the veterinarian as a vital team member. You know, they have a proactive approach to calf health programs, to vaccination, to establish treatment protocols and records. They have a commitment to timely diagnostics. If we have some problems, to send samples off to the lab, to do some necropsies on farm. They have a can-do attitude to group housing, and I'll acknowledge that this is a real challenge because, you know, we've been taught to minimize that calf-to-calf contact. And so this is, I think, maybe one of our real big challenges that we have with group housing of calves. I'd like to say that we have a little bit better nutrition, so hopefully we wind up with a calf that's in a better position to withstand some of our disease threats. And finally, I think a veterinarian who's really great at communicating with the herd owner. Great management. You know, we start off, and if you're not doing a great job with calves right now, this is probably not something that you want to do. You know, and I begin with great maternity and calving management. I want to build a good biome, or what are the bugs that are present in that calf's system? You know, is it dropped down in a beautiful, well-bedded stall or outside, and where there's a lot of good bacteria or very low levels? Do I have a great colostrum management program so that I harvest and feed that colostrum? Do I feed some extra feedings if possible? So we've got to do this or we're not going to be successful. Now, and this is probably more important for group housing because we have that calf-to-calf contact and the risk of disease spread. Can your calf personnel monitor intake? Well, we can do that with the equipment. But that's a supplement to monitoring the behavior of calves and seeing that calf that's just a little bit off today, that we're going to dig a little bit deeper and find out, what's the status of that calf. Again, with group housing, with paired or group housing, I'd like to say I want to seek a calf manager instead of a calf feeder. I want someone with those characteristics we talked about a little bit earlier. So some of the things that we need to do, we need to background those calves. And by that, I mean, we're going to feed them individually for several days, and that can be anywhere from day 1 to day 14. And I think really how successful it depends upon how good our dry cow program is, maternity, newborn care, and colostrum. I've been on farms where 2-3-day-old calves just do really well going into group housing, and others it may be 2 weeks. A lot of that's determined by personnel. They just really have the ability and the desire to take care of young animals. I'd like this backgrounding place to be convenient to that auto feeder barn. I don't want to have to load them up on a truck or trailer and haul them off even some distance within the farm to get to the auto feeder barn. And they need to be on the same liquid diet as they're going to consume later on. So training to the auto feeder, a vigorous calf is required. So I'm going to move them in the afternoon after they're fed. The first training might be the next morning. And so I'll find calves that haven't eaten, and I'm going to lead them to the feeder and turn on the pump. I can push a button and they'll find, that's where the milk comes from. I may not train them again until the afternoon or the next morning before I train them again. And I've seen people overtrain calves. By that, I mean, they go in there several times the first day and the second day. What we're doing is training those calves that, that's how I get the feed, is this person's going to walk in and lead me to the stall. And they've got to be gentle, no fear, no hurry. And sometimes it's a bit of tough love. If the weather's not too bad, you might let them get hungry. But by and large, they really learn from their peers. And, here's a facility. Now, these calves are about 2 weeks old coming in here, but I think you could all agree that these calves are ready to eat in the auto feeder. And this woman, there was a group of women taking care of the calves in this facility. They were just really, really tremendous people in terms of working with calves, and did a great job with this auto feeder facility. Now, what about herd size in the auto feeder? Well, with smaller herds, and by smaller herds, I mean less than 14 calves born per week, we have what are called dynamic pens. And we keep adding calves to the pen. And I'd like to keep those ages less than a 14-day spread. And in the smaller herds, I probably am going to have a longer backgrounding period, because I don't want to have any real young calves in there with older calves that are, more than a week, 10 days older than they are. For larger herds, what we'll do is build a pen. And so typically we might see a range of anywhere between, I have one farm I work with, they'll build a pen a day. But a lot of them, I think if they're less than 7 days, we'll start a pen and we'll just keep adding calves to it as the calves are old enough and vigorous enough. And then when the youngest calf reaches that weaning period, we'll empty out the whole pen and then let it rest for a couple of days or a couple of weeks before we repopulate it. Some guidelines, again, stocking rates, less than 25 per group. And a lot of people, that's probably the upper end. And it's not a matter of, I think, of having enough time to eat. I think it's just a management recommendation. Resting area per calf, that's resting area. That's where they can lay down. It's at least 35 square feet. And again, if we go a little bit higher, that can be better. So the next big thing, and that's establishing a feeding plan. And I want to talk about some absolutes. This is non-negotiable, and this is whether we pair house or group house. You've got to feed 8 quarts of milk a day as early as we can. And this is a really big item, because if we feed them less, they're going to be hungry, and we're going to wind up with some calves trying to cross-suck each other because they're very, very hungry. The nice thing about the auto feeder is that we have multiple smaller meals, and so it's probably less of a challenge than we'll see in some paired housing setups where we're only feeding 2 meals a day. But really important item. And when I look at intake on calves, I'll see most calves will, if they're raised right and have really good vigor, they're going to be eating 8 liters or 8 quarts by the end of, by at least 7 to 10 days of age. I want a commitment to a quality diet and a high degree of sanitation. Do you feed milk or milk replacer? Key things. Consistency is important regardless. There are combi units. Most of the more sophisticated machines will feed either or a blend of the two can be fed. A lot of how much milk we may feed, if that's the decision that we make, depends upon the supply of milk. And so we can feed a given percentage of milk and a given percentage of milk replacer. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. If we're feeding milk, and I want to emphasize this very strongly, that milk really should be pasteurized. And because even if we're feeding good milk from the dairy, there's the potential for some disease agents to pass through on that milk. This is an investment in equipment and utilities and labor. My goal is to maintain the quality from the cow to the calf. And we're already going to start out with a higher bacteria count with milk than we are with the milk replacer. Is it unsaleable or saleable milk that we use? If we're depending upon unsaleable, I'll tell people, you need to monitor how much unsaleable milk you have a day. How many pounds a day and what variation? One of the farms that I worked with did this for 7 months, and they had a variation of 100 to 800 pounds a day. So how do you manage that system? And if you have enough waste milk to feed all your calves, I think you might have some other situations that you need to address, because that's probably entirely too much. The better farms that I visited probably have enough waste milk to meet maybe a third to no more than a half of their needs. But it can be done. I know farms that feed saleable milk to calves. Milk as a liquid feed, do you have the personnel to manage that system? Realize milk's about 25% protein on a powder basis and 30% fat, so it's got more energy. The quality, if we're looking at unsaleable milk, a lot of times that solids level is down around 10% because somehow or another water has gotten into that system. A lot of potential variability of solids and nutrient levels. My recommendations there is find out, what that variable is so that you can manage it successfully. Last thing, unsaleable milk is not free. It costs you money to produce that. So when you're looking at cost of feeding calves, that needs to come into the equation. Milk replacer, pay for quality. I think every major manufacturer produces a high quality and a let's put it this way, maybe a cost conscious milk replacer. I want a minimum of 24% protein. There's where we're going to get our optimum gain. Fat, quite frankly, can be a lot of variation there. It can go up to 25% with some of the Jersey milk replacers. This is a key one, mixing temperature. That milk replacer must mix at 105 degrees. If you have a milk replacer that requires 130 to 140, it will not mix in a automatic calf feeder. It will not mix. So you must have it to where it mixes more at feeding temperature. Milk replacers really simplify management. I know some farms that when they got the automatic calf feeders, they started out with milk replacer because is simpler and they could focus on managing that first. And then maybe later on, if they wanted to bring milk in, they could do that. But to do that, you have to have a feeder that will enable you to deliver milk as well as milk replacer. So which one? I think you can be successful at both if they're properly managed. So feeding plans, the amount per day, and I will call these ad-lib plans, where for the first 28 days, you let the calves drink what they want. And you go, oh my goodness. But you limit them, and all the auto feeder companies talk about liters instead of quarts, okay? So it's roughly equivalent. But we're going to limit them to 2 liters per meal or visit. And then for a lot of them, they have to wait. If they drink that 2 liters, they have to wait 2 hours until that machine will let them have another meal. And at the 28th day to 32, I reduced from ad lib down to 8 liters a day. What that is a little wake-up call. Said, okay, free ride's over. It's time to get serious about eating calf starter. We hold that at 8 liters per day to stimulate starter intake, and then we gradually wean them from 42 to 56 days from 8 liters to 2 liters. And this is a system I've found really is quite successful. I will say that some calves will drink as many as 16 liters of milk. That's a lot of milk. And I've asked farms, well, do you want to go to a restricted feeding plan where we can limit them to 12? And some farms say, yeah, probably so. And others like to enable that ad lib intake. And I will say this, intake with calves is just like with people. You know, some calves have phenomenal appetites and others may not drink more than 8 to 9 liters a day. And the other one that's very interesting is it varies a fair amount from day to day. So with this plan, then I gradually reduce them from 12 liters down to 2 liters from 32 to 56 days. And it really can be equally successful. Solids level, for feeding milk replacer, I put 150 grams of powder in a liter of water. That's 13% solids. That's about what milk is. Meal sizes, I'll tend to make those a little bit smaller for younger calves, and then I'll get them larger for older calves. So, next poll question, how much? I'll let you take over there, Mike.
Okay, very good. We'll give you a break there, Bob. Here's a question for you. How much milk should a 3-week-old calf be fed? And you have 4 choices. Select one, 4 quarts, 6 quarts, 8 quarts, or as much as they want to drink. Well, hopefully you've been paying attention. I think this will help you out a little bit here. Anyway, the polls are open and we're off and running here, and we are voting, and we are getting up. We're over 50%. Boy, the Democrats, Republicans are really going at it today, Jim. I'll tell you, they're just not messing around as far as that goes. Anyway, Abby, where's your answer?
I'll pick the last one as much as I want, I guess, to take full advantage of the auto feeder system. As long as you don't mind those couple calves that are going to drink a lot, as Bob had mentioned.
Well, obviously, Horge is paying the bill, so there's no concern about cost. Anyway, let's go ahead and close the polls. We're at 68%, and about we had that call earlier. How many people are voting? And that's typically out of 225 people. So here we go. What do you think, Robert?
There you go. Well, obviously, we've got some people buying into the point I want to make to this, which is very interesting, is we're not forcing a calf to drink 8 quarts or 6 quarts. Okay. They drink what they want. And so some days the calf may drink 8 quarts, and sometimes they're going to drink a whole lot more. And I think we've all been led into the idea that, well, I put this 4-quart bottle out there and boy, they drained that thing. And then if I give them 3 4-quart bottles, they're going to drink all of that. Well, these guys will drink what they want to drink. And I think that's the real change in mindset that I find with the auto feeders is we're not forcing that calf to drink. So next one, sanitation. Let's have the same mindset with the auto feeder as we have for the milking system for our CIP. Most of those major manufacturers, they will automatically, at least twice a day clean the whole system, and up to 4 times a day for the mixer and the heat exchanger. Some of them will rinse the line after each calf. Some of them will spray the nipple after each calf. But we're really making some great advances in terms of that. We did some field work looking at sanitation of that, and quite frankly, the automatic cleaning of the mixer and the heat exchanger and that line out to the nipple was really pretty successful I think in mitigating any potential health issues with that calf. But there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think we've really made some great progress, and probably a whole lot better than you'll see a lot of farms that fed in buckets, and they didn't clean the bucket each time after we fed calves. And so I think we've made some big advantages. Now, data for what I call proactive. Feeding behavior. Realize it's very variable from calf to calf and within calf. So we can look at trends in consumption and drinking speed, and we can set some alarms that, well, if this calf is 70% of the previous 3-day average of consumption or drinking speed, that's going to put an alarm out there. Now, I want to make a very important emphasis here. This data is a supplement to visual observation. A lot of times what I would like to do, or most calf managers, they walk the pens first and say, here's a couple calves in here, look like they're a little bit off. And then they go back and look at the data. I find if we look at the data, sometimes we don't really acutely look at all the calves in a pen. So here's an example, and I think we'll show some other examples here. But this is an example of a calf with the Forster Technic system, and we can see how this is what the calf was allowed to drink. Now, this is on a allowed, but remember, this is ad lib all the way up to here. So that calf went all the way up to 8 liters at about probably 7 days of age. They dropped off a little bit here, so that would be a concern. But then it really pops up and it peaked out at 12 liters. But look at the variation from day to day. And this one's probably incomplete because the day's not over. The other thing that I look at is drinking speed. And so typically those calves really go to town in the beginning because they're used to gobbling down their milk because they only got fed twice a day. And then it drops down when they realize that, hey, that stuff's always there and I don't need to be in a real big hurry. We got a couple of reds here. So if I hadn't picked up that calf on my first pass through, I'd probably go back out and check on that calf again. But we've got some really neat data, and I'll be very honest, we really haven't even scratched the surface. There's some folks at University of Minnesota who've looked at this, and there's some other scientists who are looking at it. One of the problems we have in using that as an absolute predictor is we already have such tremendous variation. Now, that's on a data. Now, it can be cloud-based or on the handheld. And I've got my cell phone here, and this is my personal cell phone, and I can look at information on individual calves on a dairy. And that dairy could be in Virginia, it could be in Australia, and I'll get live data on that calf. We're working now on getting some summaries of that. Now, I can also pick up that data on a handheld that's right next to the autofeeder. And so we can see the same thing. We can see drinking speed. We can see some of that similar information that's available on the handheld that's right there at the feeder. Now, although I've looked at that, Holman Lau also has some excellent software where we can visualize information on individual calves. They graphically portray some of this information as well. And then the urban plan also has that data, not only at the feeder, but then also whether it be on a tablet or on a cell phone. So we've really got some wonderful opportunities for monitoring that calf. And I think this is an area that I really get pretty excited about in the future with monitoring auto feeders. So, are auto feeders in your herd's future? I'll be the first to say that this system is not for everyone. The farm that I've worked with here, I think did it the right way. They raised calves in hutches. They said, we're going to go out and buy an auto feeder. And they had a facility where they could put that auto feeder, feed 2 pens of calves and just really see how they liked it. They did. And so they went ahead and made the plans and built a facility. This one has 8 pens of calves in there, 4 feeders, with the ability to extend on either end as the herd style. Does the system fit your management style? What is your management style? And I think one of the big challenges that I see on farms is that the farm manager or the herd manager, let's put it this way, calves are not a real high priority. And so, as long as there's no tragedies, going to let that program kind of stand on its own. So when does it become a problem? Maybe when we start having a high incidence of disease or we start losing calves. And that's too late. That's too late. So I really like the system for the ability to really fit into a management style where the herd manager likes to look at some data And quite frankly, I can scroll through there pretty quickly and see what the situation might be in a given pen of calves. The other question that I have, are you considering more robotics in the future? As we started having more robotic dairies, it was very interesting for me to go on the farm and see how the type of data that managers looked at changed from what we had conventionally. And I think the same is true with robotics in calf feeding. We've got an opportunity to automatically record some information. And I think to really move us to the next level in calf management, to be a lot more proactive, to pick up problems maybe a little bit sooner. Some of the systems also enable us to monitor herd health. One of the systems, I can walk into the pen with my tablet. If I have a calf that obviously has some problems, I can take its temperature with a Bluetooth thermometer. It automatically syncs with that calf record. We can do treatments with that calf and record that and tie those health records in to the calf autofeeder records and make it a whole lot more inclusive. And then that information ideally would fall into that animal's lifetime record as well when they become cows. So, are autofeeders in your herd's future? I think, quite frankly, all of us should look at group and paired housing. They offer some real significant benefits for the calf. You talk to the folks that have gone through paired housing and see some real potential advantages to those calves. I think they're a lot more calm. Starter intake tends to be a whole lot quicker. And maybe those things transition to having animals when they enter the lactating herd that are just a whole lot more calm and adapt better. I think there are advantages for the herd owner. And the other one is, I think, there's some advantages in our relationship with the consumer. When I see a pen of calves, and I have a blog, and one of the really great things is we have some great videos of some of the calves in the autofeeder pens, and you see a bunch of calves with the tails up over their back and they're running around the pen versus those that might be in individual hutches, regardless of what a great job that we do. I think this is a potential advantage that we've got with paired or with group housing. So, in kind of finishing up today, let's optimize the calf program for the future. I'm most excited about the potential, particularly for the autofeeders, to match the biology of calf growth and development. I think we can meet their nutrient requirements in a whole lot more desirable fashion. Smaller meals, higher daily intake, a lot less stress on that calf. Really enhance the opportunities, I think, for a lot smoother weaning of calves and adapting to that situation after weaning. Advantages of calf behavior, and does that translate to better cow behavior? I don't think we have the research to support it, but certainly as I speak to some producers, they believe it exists. I like to say labor efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. And the key thing there is getting the right person in that facility that has the skills and the desire to do those things effectively. Labor, quite frankly, it concerns me in the future with calf feeding. It's very labor intensive to feed milk or milk replacer, to feed water, to bed those calves. And I think all of us would agree that labor is a real big challenge. And if we can make our dairy labor people more satisfied and more effective, I think it can be a win-win. Nutrient management, really haven't talked about that, but I know that that's a consideration as we move down the road, whether we have a hutch-based system or a confinement system. We're going to need to account for the nutrients being produced by those calves and how we manage that. And finally, this is an investment in calf management. And I think it's a change. One of the changes that I'll go back to as we look at some of the things that we have with calf management is that more sex semen, So we're raising fewer heifers, which means that we can tolerate less mortality and less morbidity in those calves because we have fewer ones. In the past, we used to look at selling our surplus heifers. On our current financial situation, that's probably not very profitable in all situations. And so we need to do a better job of the calves that we're raising and enable them to express their genetic potential. And I think we have the potential with autofeeders to do that. So I would like to thank everybody for to joining today's webinar. I think we've got some questions a little bit later on, but Abby, Dr. Hudgens.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. James, for that informative presentation. I think auto feeders and group housing are certainly growing in popularity and come up in a lot of conversations, but as you said, they're not the right fit for every person or every farm. So for the people that do choose to go this route in the future with their calf housing, I think you offered a lot of best management practices that can be put into practice as they go down that road of more automation in their calf raising system. So thank you for all that insight you shared today. Once again, I would also like to thank TechMix for serving as a sponsor for this webinar. If you want to learn more about their company, feel free to check them out online. They also provided a fact sheet, which you can find with the handouts of the presentation slides. So if you want to see what is included there, please download the handouts, which you can find in that handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. And also, if you have any questions for Dr. James, please type them into the question tab right now, because we will be answering them in just a minute or two. If you want to move ahead a slide, we will talk about our upcoming webinars. These monthly webinars are held the second Monday of every month. And in October on the 11th, we will have an update on cow cooling and ventilation, and this will be focusing on adult dairy cattle. Our presenter will be Nigel Cook, who is a veterinarian and a professor with the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Veterinary Medicine. And that webinar will be sponsored by Tunnel Plus. And then in November on the 8th, we'll have a forage and feed outlook presented by our very own Mike Hutchins with the University of Illinois, and one of my fellow editors, Mike Rankin, our managing editor for Hay and Forage Grower magazine. And that webinar will be sponsored by Cargill. So we hope that you will make plans to join us for these future webinars. Prior to each webinar, our attendees do have the opportunity to turn in some questions. So we had a few that came in prior to today's session. So we'll have Dr. James answer those. And then we have a large group of questions that have come in today. So we look forward to getting a little more insight from you as we move through these questions. So Mike, why don't you go ahead and get started with them?
Okay, Bob, we're off and running here. This question comes from Canada, and it says, do automatic feeders create more cross-sucking in calves? And tied in with that is, how do you eliminate that cross-sucking in housed calves? And several other people raised that same questions online.
Yeah, and I hopefully addressed that just a little bit. And I think that, one of the key things there is the fact that calves have a whole lot more milk to consume. And so they don't have that hunger. Animal behavior is a real challenging thing because it's not black and white. I've personally not seen a whole lot of challenges with cross-sucking in the autofeeder setup when we feed enough milk. As I said, our bare minimum is 8 liters or 8 quarts a day. I do like the ad-lib system. The nice thing is that we gradually taper those calves down over in my automated or in my ad-lib feeding. Over 4 days, we drop them from ad-lib down to 8. We hold them there a little while, and then we taper them off. And so I think we wind up with a whole lot less disruptive situations, I guess I might say. And, how do you eliminate it in group house calves when it already occurs? And that's a tough one, and I have seen it on some farms. It's almost, we talk about the benefits of calves teaching each other things. That can also apply on the downside. But I've probably only seen this in a few places where we do have cross-sucking and it's there. Other things that I've seen people do is to put some play toys in the pen. It might be a ball, it might be something hanging from the ceiling that calves can get exposed to. It's my best answer there is that we got to make sure we feed them enough milk, and that's probably the biggest thing. It might be a bigger problem in pair house calves than it is in group house calves, and this is just my own personal opinion. It's probably more of a problem in animals that are put in pairs or in groups later in life, as in 14 days of age, because they're very used to, by gosh, when that nipple comes in there, we're going to go to town and we're going to really suck it down because it's going to be 8 to 12 hours before we get another meal. And I think that has some bearing. So if I had pair house calves, I'd like to stretch out that milking interval as long as I can, and get it closer to 12 so that we don't have these short and long intervals. But I think that's one of the considerations. As I looked at the data that I had on the farm that I'm working with right now, they're on the ad lib feeding program. And one of the things I've noticed is that their drinking speed, and we saw that from the one slide, the drinking speed is a whole lot lower than I see in farms that restrict the amount of milk that they can consume. What I have seen in farms that limit early on to 8 liters, those calves may consume their allocation in the first 12 hours of the day or maybe the first 16 hours of the day. And then they've got the rest of the day when they're not allowed to be able to drink anything. Some of them will go into the feeding stall and suck the heck out of the nipple, knowing that they can't get anything more. But I have seen on the ad lib that their drinking speeds are lower and they tend to be a lot calmer and a little bit more relaxed. So I hope that, just to summarize, I do like ad lib. We got to feed enough milk. For pair housing calves, I liked it so we don't have too short and too long of an interval between those feedings. And boy, if we can feed 3 times a day, if they're in paired housing, I think that's even better.
Okay, Bob, do you want to move the next slide? And now we're in the speed round, so we're off and running. Here is the next question. What is the typical or lowest cost per pound of gain you found in these automatic feeders? What is kind of a target number you're looking at?
Oh boy, that's it's very interesting. If you look at the price of milk, and you want to feed 8 quarts of milk, I need to get my my calculator out here. I can't give you I'm not being evasive, but
well, you can do, Bob, is send that to Abby, and she can make it a question.
Well,
question and
I'm
answer.
just looking. If I'm feeding 2 quarts of $15 milk, that's $2.40 a day. Now, $2.40 a day, and we realize I'm kind of winging it here, but that's going to be, I would expect to see 1.5 pounds a gain there. If we have nice weather, when it gets cold, quite frankly, 2 gallons of milk is not going to let us have a whole lot of gain. So environment has a real big role in determining what that cost per pound of gain is going to be. I will say at 4 quarts a day, your cost per pound of gain is going to be infinity, because for a long time, you're not going to have enough energy, particularly energy, to support any gain at all. And I see this on some low-cost feeding operations. This is not auto feeders, but these are low-cost feeding operations where, over 8 weeks, the calves are gaining 1/2 to 6/10 pound of gain a day. And these are farms that feed, 4 to 6 quarts a day. And so environment plays a real big role in that. Now, that's just feed cost right there. It's just feed cost that we're looking at. So granted, we do have a pretty sizable investment in that facility.
Okay, next question. Any changes with Jerseys versus Holsteins in terms of the plan that you walked us through?
What I would probably do, I'd still let them do ad lib early on. And I'm a Jersey guy. Okay, I raised Jerseys for many years, and I raised them wrong. I fed them 4 quarts a day and wondered why they were so skinny. We actually developed the Jersey milk replacer based upon some research at Virginia Tech, and that led us to the 25% fat. And so it's interesting what they will consume. I probably would let them have the ad lib. I would then back it off to maybe 6 liters instead of 8. And that would be my change that I would have in that ad lib feeding plan. So I let them ad lib for 28 to 30 days. Over 4 days, drop them down to 6, hold them at 6 for 10 days, and then gradually wean them. Would be my recommendation. I think one of the nice things, you notice the one picture at Virginia Tech, we commingle the Jerseys and the Holsteins. And so you can have a different feeding plan for the Jerseys than you do for the Holsteins. And I think that works, providing that you don't have real high population in those pens. And I think it's another thing that you really must be very cognizant of, is making sure we have a very strong and vigorous calf coming on those auto feeders. And
okay. In your experiences, are there conditions or times of the year when calves on auto feeders can be challenged? And if so, what is your solution?
I think the biggest challenge that I see with calves on auto feeders is maybe not the auto feeder, but it's the facility, and making sure that we have good ventilation. The problem that probably the biggest problem that I see is people say, well, we have open sidewalls, so we don't need all those fans. Well, at 10 o'clock at night or 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, the wind's not blowing, and if you live somewhere down in where the wind blows all the time, that's not as big of an issue, but you can get into some really pretty bad air. And maybe one of the biggest challenges that I see with group housing, and not necessarily just with auto feeders, and that's with ventilation, is making sure that we have plenty of fresh air that's coming into that facility 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. Again, I give credit to Dairyland Initiative at Wisconsin. They've got a phenomenal program there on the positive pressure tubes. There are other ways to do it, but that's probably the biggest challenge that I see with auto feeders, and that's with having a good ventilation system for those calves all the time. I think that, with auto feeders, the calves can respond a whole lot better to the environmental conditions if we've got a really good dry cow, maternity, and newborn care program. And some really great work done in Florida that I think documents that, heat-stressed cows, close-up cows, will calve early. And that transmits to having a calf with more problems. So I guess I might say that we might expect to see more issues in those animals during heat stress. And that would be probably my biggest environmental concern. They're just coming into that auto feeder setup, not quite as ambitious and aggressive as I'd like to see them.
Okay, Bob, question is, how important is hole size, and how often do you have to replace the nipple?
Well, most of the manufacturers have their own nipples, and it's very important that you use what they provide. Again, don't try and cut corners by buying something that's cheaper. And so the hole size is really, it shows that hole, and it's a lot bigger than what we see in, with nipple bottles. It's a very, very different type of nipple. And two of the reasons why we worry less about that is there's 2 ways that calves can consume that milk. First of all, they can suck it from that mixing bowl. And generally that's going to be in a tube that might be, hopefully as short as possible, but it's going to be 3 or 4 feet long. And so it take a little bit to get them started with that. Generally the machine will pump that initial flow in there to get it going, but then it relies on that calf. What a lot of people have gone to is using a peristaltic pump where you can control the milk flow. So they really can't get gorged with milk like you would see with feeding a calf with a nipple bottle where the hole got too big or the air bleed hole got too big. So first thing, use the nipples that the manufacturer uses. Don't try to cut corners there. It's a very different nipple. And then consider, if I was designing an auto feeder, I'd probably use the peristaltic pump to really regulate how much milk flow that's coming for that calf. And I think that's an important consideration.
Okay, Bob, do you see any more abomasal disorders on the automated versus manual feeding? I assume we're talking bloat and perhaps acidosis.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a whole lot less because, typically when I've seen the bloat issues that we have with calves, and that's with calves that really gorge on milk just way too quickly, such as you might see with a nipple bottle where the hole's too big, or with bucket feeding. I've seen calves with bucket feeding and they stick their nose down in there and they just flat vacuum that milk up. And anything that creates, I think, those surges of nutrients really concern me. Now, the second part of that is sanitation. And, I'll be very honest in saying that with sanitation, some of these can be pretty nasty. And so there's one where I really emphasize the sanitation. The best farms that I work with, these folks go out and they scrub the feeding stall every day. They make sure the area where that calf's head is scrubbed very clear, that there's a really good environment, and they keep things spotlessly clean. And this applies whether I'm talking about auto feeders or buckets or bottles. My ultimate judgment on that is looking at the person and saying, well, would you drink from that? And granted, we've got a calf that's sucking from this, but I've seen some situations where things are just really unacceptable, and that doesn't need. And I think there's where we can run into some of the problems. Now, we talked about acidosis, and not probably from milk. Rumen drinkers will wind up with some weird situations there. That's probably not going to happen at all with an auto feeder, because where our flow rates are a whole lot less on those calves. And the calves don't have that sense of urgency to drink, because, boy, I'm not going to get any more milk in the next 8 to 12 hours. One of the comments that, I guess the question that I like to raise is that, why do cows eat twice a day? Is it because we fed calves twice a day when they were babies? Interesting point. I don't know that we've got any research to support that, but I think what we're doing is training an animal to have a lot more relaxed atmosphere in terms of consuming their diet than we see in calves that are fed twice a day or even 3 times a day. Anybody that's fed calves, you turn on the lights in the morning in the calf barn, or the calves hear that truck coming, and what do? They're all running up to the front there screaming bloody murder. And you don't see that with an auto feeder situation where the auto feeder is working well. And, you walk into the barn and the calves kind of look at you and say, well, so what? They're a lot more calm, and there's a great difference in their behavior.
Well, Bob, you got 2 people who are real fans. They want to thank you very much. They had no questions, but thanks for the great presentation. But we have another question for you, and that is, do calves, do you recommend solid pen stalls or see-through as far as training and utilizing the automated feeders? You know what the question is?
Yeah, I think so. And that's a good question. And if we've got a good feeding plan with that, there's really not much problem in terms of whether we have an open-sided feeding stall. In fact, most of what I've seen is an open-sided feeding stall, because the calves are not as urgent. You don't see them stacked up. Now, I did on that one video, but those calves had just come in from calf hutches onto that auto feeder, so they were hungry. But in most cases, they're really not. You don't see folks backed up at the feeder. If they are, maybe there's something wrong with the feeder and it's not delivering feed correctly, or you might be limiting feed. So generally, you don't see that real sense of urgency. The other thing that I don't care for, and I've seen this in some designs, is that when the calves stick their head in to drink milk, it's all enclosed. And, you know, you can get some pretty nasty air. I had a farm that I worked with, and, you know, we had more of the respiratory disease than I had anticipated. And I started looking at things, and well, underneath it was a pretty much of a closed in stall. And right underneath there was an opening where all the drainage was coming into, you know, from the spit from the calves and what they didn't drink, or some milk might have dribbled, and it was gone down into an open pipe that was gone into essentially into the manure system. And I thought, that's got to be some pretty nasty air coming up through there. And so we got that all sealed up, and surprisingly, you know, we've had a lot less problems. And so from a ventilation standpoint, I guess I'd like it a little bit more open. And that's going to work when I think we have calves that are well trained not to be, you know, real concerned about the availability of feed.
We have another question. What is the best way to offer a starter and water in the group pen?
Yeah, real good question. Excellent. One question, or one point that I want to make first of all, is that everybody needs to have their water tested for their calves, and to make sure, and I recommend this every 6 months. I've seen some real train wrecks because there's been some problem with either mineral content or bacteria content in the water, and particularly if it's a different water source than we have for the milking herd. So water quality is very important. I don't like to see the waters right up against where the feeding stalls are, you know, and I like to see those off just a little bit so that we don't get too much congregation there. I pay really close attention to how clean those waters are. I'm going to clean them out every day. Cleaning in the water is just as important as cleaning on that milking stall. And what was the other question on that?
Where would you place it? The starter placement and the water step.
Yeah,
placement.
the starter, and this is another really good point. I don't like to see headlocks, you know, for the babies where they have to put their head in through a headlock. It makes a noise and it really disturbs those baby calves. I've seen some people have a small bunk that they'll put in the pen, and they'll do that, you know, right at the get-go so that the calves don't have to stick their head through that pen. And the calves will start nibbling on that. You know, when we talk about calf starters, my first concern is how palatable it is. Does it taste good for the calves? And I think that's very, very important for those calves, is the palatability. And then we can talk about protein, you know, probably at least 20% protein, and 22 might be a little bit better. But I think those are very important considerations. But a lot of people will start with that feed bunk just inside the pen. And then as calves start eating, they'll put it on the other side of that fence. And it's, you know, it's on the same side as we have for the auto feeder, where the auto feeder is located, but generally not right up against the auto feeder. You want to have a little bit of space and not get too crowded in there. But I do not like headlocks. And I think, and I've talked to some other folks, and that's pretty much of a unified. What happens with headlocks too, it makes the noise, but sometimes calves will, they'll slip and go down and they'll get trapped in that headlock. And if you're not there, it can have undesirable consequences. So I do not like to see headlocks, just open slats that we have to keep the calf from walking through, but enable them to stick their head through. And then you can put that feed trough on the other side. And it can be either a flat floor or a bunk. I really like the half round PVC pipes that tend to work really pretty well.
I think this will be our last question, Bob. But why do we wait 2 hours for the next meal? Why not 4 hours? And is there a minimum amount that you want to have in each meal?
Yeah, good point. And typically, as an example, on the baby calves, I might start with a 1.5 liter allocation for a meal. 2 hours is baby calves will eat more frequently, and they'll drink smaller meals. And typically what you will see is with the older calves, I'll increase that meal size. And then what happens is that those calves will come to the feeder. A baby calf may come to the feeder, by a baby, I mean a 2-week-old calf. They may come to the feeder 6, 7, 8 times a day. As they get older and we give them larger meals, that may drop down to 3 or 4 meals a day. And again, the older calves are able to tolerate those larger meals better than a younger calf will. So that's a little bit of a moving target. Younger calves, smaller meal size. I like to keep it at 2 hours. I've seen it as low as an hour, but then you get a very high stall utilization, and that calves keep coming back to the feeder. So it's a bit of a compromise there. And then as we get older, I increase the meal size. I usually leave the time about the same, but typically calves will eat a bigger meal and then they're not as hungry to come back to the feeder.
Well, very good. There are several other questions, but I think you've answered all of the other questions in your webinar or in the Q&A here. So Abby, we'll turn the program back to you. And Bob, thanks much.
You bet. My pleasure.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. And yes, we'll go through the questions. If there's anything that wasn't addressed, we will talk to Bob about that and we can investigate those answers. But thank you all so much for your active participation and asking so many really good questions. And of course, thank you, Bob, for addressing many of these topics in your presentation and then offering some thoughtful information at the end in regard to those particular questions. So we really, really appreciate that. If you would look forward on your calendars, want to let you know that our upcoming webinars will be in October. We'll be talking about ventilation with Dr. Nigel Cook. And then in November, we'll be talking about a feed and forage outlook, looking at the harvest season, and then what people can plan for feed inventories and opportunities in 2022. So please make plans to attend one or both of those webinars if those topics are interesting to you. One more time, I'd like to thank Bob James for his time today and presenting this webinar for us. We really appreciate the information you have provided and the insight you were able to share with our audience on auto feeders and raising calves in groups. Also, I'd like to thank TechMix for their support of our webinar today. It is certainly appreciated to have companies that partner with us on these educational opportunities. And then, of course, I would like to thank our audience out there. You're a very active group of participants, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for our webinars each month. So thank you very much for that. Until next time, we'll say goodbye here from all of us at Hordes Dairyman and our team at the University of Illinois. So please take care, and we'll hope to see you again in a future webinar.